The rain in Seattle was relentless the day Sarah Jenkins lost everything. She stood in the foyer of the $3 million home she had decorated, clutching a single cardboard box containing a few sweaters, a photo album, and a cheap coffee mug. Her husband of 8 years, Richard Caldwell, stood by the door, his arms crossed over his tailored Italian suit. Beside him was his lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Gregory Abernathy. "It's all in the prenup, Sarah," Richard said, his voice completely devoid of the warmth she had once fallen in love with. "The infidelity clause is ironclad." "But I didn't do anything," Sarah's voice broke, echoing off the marble floors. The private investigator's photos, cleverly doctored images showing her entering a hotel with a man she had never met, were a masterclass in fabrication. Richard had wanted out, and he had wanted his pharmaceutical fortune entirely protected. He had orchestrated a flawless, brutal exit. "The court disagrees," Abernathy interjected smoothly. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. The accounts have been frozen. Your credit cards are cancelled." At 34, Sarah was thrown onto the street with exactly $42 in her purse, a dead cell phone, and a sudden, terrifying void where her future used to be. She spent the first 3 nights sleeping in her 10-year-old Honda Civic in a Walmart parking lot, crying until her ribs ached. It was on the 4th day that a forwarded letter caught up to her at a P.O. box she had hastily rented. It was from a probate court in Maine. Her great-aunt Josephine, a woman Sarah hadn't seen since she was 7, had passed away. Having no other living relatives, Josephine had left Sarah her sole asset, a derelict commercial property in the coastal town of Oak Haven, Maine. It was an abandoned bakery. Oak Haven was a town that time, and the interstate highway had deliberately bypassed. It was perpetually draped in sea fog, smelling of salt, pine, and wet asphalt. When Sarah finally pulled up to the address on Elm Street, her heart sank into her worn-out sneakers. Josephine's Sweets was a disaster. The front windows were caked in years of grime, the green awning was shredded like ribbons, and the brass bell above the door hung by a single rusted screw. Inside, it was a graveyard of culinary ambitions. Industrial ovens sat like rusted iron beasts. The floorboards were warped, and the smell of stale flour and mildew was thick enough to choke on. But Sarah had no money for a hotel, let she alone a flight back to the West Coast. She had no choice. She bought a cheap sleeping bag, a broom, and a gallon of bleach. For the first 2 weeks, she lived on peanut butter sandwiches and tap water, scrubbing the bakery from dawn until her muscles screamed in agony. She sold her Honda Civic for $800 to a local mechanic named Dale. With that money, she bought bulk flour, yeast, salt, sugar, and basic baking supplies. She didn't have the capital to repair the massive industrial mixers, so she used her hands. Every morning at 3 a.m., Sarah stood at the scarred wooden butcher block, aggressively kneading massive mounds of dough. She poured all her anger, her grief, and her betrayal into the flour. She punched the dough, stretched it, folded it, and shaped it. When she opened the doors on a brisk Tuesday morning, the smell of fresh, crusty sourdough and sweet cinnamon rolls drifted down Elm Street. Her first customer was an elderly woman named Mrs. Higgins, who bought a loaf out of pity. By the time Mrs. Higgins returned the next day, bringing 2 friends, it wasn't pity, it was demand. Sarah's bread, born of sheer desperation and rage, was magnificent. Slowly, the town of Oak Haven began to embrace her. Detective Arthur Pendleton, a gruff local cop with a soft spot for pastries, became a regular. He would sit at the single rickety table in the corner, drinking black coffee and watching Sarah work, offering quiet nods of approval. For 6 months, Sarah lived in a state of exhausting, blistered peace. She was poor, but she was surviving. She was rebuilding, until the plumbing gave out. It happened during a torrential nor'easter in late November. The ancient pipes groaned, sputtered, and finally burst, sending a foot of murky water flooding into the bakery's deep basement. Sarah hadn't spent much time in the basement. It was a cavernous, dirt-floored space, used only for storing broken chairs and old filing cabinets. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and rented rubber waders, she went down to assess the damage. The water had receded, leaving behind a thick layer of foul-smelling mud. As Sarah was dragging a ruined cardboard box toward the stairs, she slipped. She crashed hard against the far western wall of the cellar. The sound wasn't the dull thud of solid brick. It was a hollow, echoing crack. Sarah froze. She shined her flashlight onto the wall. The mortar here was different, newer, sloppier than the rest of the 1920s foundation. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. Intrigued and unsettled, she grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the tool pile by the stairs. She drove the crowbar into the mortar. It crumbled easily. She swung again, harder this time. After 10 minutes of grueling work, a large section of the brickwork collapsed inward, revealing a pitch-black cavity. A stale metallic odor wafted out. Sarah squeezed her shoulders through the rough opening, her flashlight piercing the darkness. She found herself in a hidden, windowless room, roughly 10 by 12 feet. It was lined with heavy acoustic foam, rotting and peeling from the walls. In the center of the room sat a massive, cast-iron machine that looked like a vintage printing press. But it wasn't for printing newspapers. Stacked on metal shelving units around the room were reams of specialized cotton blend paper. Beside them were heavy metal plates etched with intricate reverse designs. And in the corner, spilling out of a partially decayed canvas duffel bag, were banded stacks of $100 bills. Millions of them. Sarah dropped her flashlight. It clattered against the concrete, the beam illuminating a heavy steel safe tucked under a wooden desk. The door of the safe was slightly ajar. Panic seized her throat. This wasn't just a secret room, it was a federal crime scene. She was standing in a sophisticated counterfeiting operation. If the police found this, who would believe the bankrupt, disgraced ex-wife of a billionaire didn't know about it? Trembling, she approached the desk. Inside the open safe, there was no more money. Instead, there was a stack of manila folders and a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with meticulously recorded transactions, dates, and names. She scanned the columns, her eyes adjusting to the dim, reflected light. The entries dated back 15 years. The operation had been massive, washing fake money through legitimate businesses across the eastern seaboard. Then, her eyes locked onto a name near the bottom of a page dated just 3 years ago. Caldwell Holdings, LLC. Sarah stopped breathing. Caldwell Holdings, Richard's primary shell company. She flipped the page, her hand shaking so violently she nearly tore the paper. More entries. Richard Caldwell, wire transfer offshore, plate maintenance. And then a loose piece of paper slipped out from the back of the ledger. It was a copy of a deed transfer. It showed the legal transfer of Josephine Sweets from the estate of Josephine Miller. But it wasn't transferred to Sarah Jenkins naturally. The document bore Richard's signature as a legal guarantor, alongside a forged signature of her aunt. The horrifying truth crashed over her like a physical blow. Richard hadn't just thrown her out. He hadn't just framed her for infidelity. He was part of a massive counterfeiting ring that used this abandoned bakery as a distribution hub. When the heat started coming down, or when his partners wanted out, Richard needed a patsy. He had forged the probate documents. He had legally tied the property and the hidden contraband to Sarah. He orchestrated her complete financial ruin so she would have absolutely no choice but to move to Oakhaven and occupy the building. He was waiting for the perfect moment to tip off the FBI. She wouldn't just lose her marriage. She would spend the rest of her life in federal prison, neatly tying up Richard's loose ends forever. Anger is a funny thing. When it peaks, it doesn't manifest as screaming or crying. It manifests as a chilling, absolute calm. Sarah didn't run upstairs and call the police. She knew that a man with Richard's wealth and connections would slip away if the evidence wasn't airtight. He would claim she forged the ledger to frame him in a bitter divorce dispute. She needed to catch him in the act. She needed him in that basement. She carefully put the ledger back in the safe. She crawled out of the hole, replaced the bricks as best she could, and stacked several heavy bags of flour in front of the wall to conceal the damage. For the next 3 days, Sarah baked. She smiled at Mrs. Higgins. She poured coffee for Detective Pendleton. She played the part of the oblivious, struggling baker perfectly. But at night, she was a ghost, tracking down information on her one cheap laptop. She found the contact information for Special Agent Thomas of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Boston. She made a phone call from a burner phone she bought at a gas station using a voice disguiser app. She gave them a single tip: watch the Caldwell Holdings accounts next Tuesday night, and watch the old bakery in Oakhaven. Then she used her real phone to send a text to Richard's personal number, a number she knew he never changed. I found the basement. Richard. I found the press. And I found the ledger. I want $10 million, or I call the feds. It was a massive gamble. Would he send a hitman, or would his colossal ego and need for control force him to handle it himself? Tuesday night brought a vicious storm off the Atlantic. The rain lashed against the windows of the bakery, rattling the old glass in its frames. At 11:45 p.m., the lock on the back alley door clicked. Sarah was sitting in the dark behind the pastry counter, a heavy cast-iron rolling pin resting on her lap. Her heart was a drum in her ears. The door creaked open. A tall figure stepped into the kitchen, a silencer-equipped pistol gleaming in the faint, ambient light from the street lamps outside. It was Richard. He was wearing a dark raincoat, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "Sarah," he called out softly, his voice echoing in the empty bakery. "Come on out, sweetheart. We need to have a little chat about your extortion attempt." Sarah stood up, hitting the main light switch. Richard blinked against the sudden harsh fluorescence. He aimed the gun directly at her chest, a cruel, familiar smirk playing on his lips. "I have to admit, I underestimated you. I thought you'd just cry in the corner until the FBI raided the place." "You set me up," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady. "You ruined my life just to cover your tracks." "It was nothing personal, Sarah, just business," Richard chuckled, stepping closer. The counterfeiting ring was getting messy. The original owners wanted to talk to the feds. I had to quiet them down, take over the operation, and find a scapegoat to take the fall when I shut it down. You were convenient." "The infidelity?" she asked. "A necessary fiction to leave you destitute," he replied casually. "A desperate woman taking refuge in a dead aunt's bakery? It's a tragic story. Especially when she's found dead by suicide after the guilt of her massive counterfeiting operation becomes too much." He raised the gun, aiming for her head. "Now, where is the ledger?" "It's right here, Richard." A voice boomed from the doorway leading to the alley. Richard whipped around. Standing there, soaked to the bone, and holding a 12-gauge shotgun leveled directly at Richard's chest, was Detective Arthur Pendleton. Behind him, The alley suddenly lit up with blinding red and blue strobe lights. The sound of sirens tore through the stormy night. Armored vehicles screeched to a halt at the front and rear of the bakery. "Drop the weapon, Caldwell," Pendleton roared. "Federal agents, drop it now." Richard's face drained of all color. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at Sarah, then at the shotgun, and slowly lowered his pistol, dropping it onto the flour-dusted floorboards. As FBI agents swarmed the kitchen, throwing Richard against the steel prep tables and slapping cuffs on his wrists, Special Agent Thomas stepped inside. He looked at Richard, then at Sarah. "We got his audio confession on the wire you wore, Miss Jenkins," Thomas said, nodding respectfully. "Combined with the ledger and his financial records, he's never seeing the outside of a cell again." Sarah looked down at Richard, whose cheek was pressed hard against the table, where she kneaded her dough every morning. He glared up at her with pure hatred. "You took my money," Sarah said quietly, looking down at the man who had tried to destroy her. "You took my home. You tried to take my freedom and my life." She leaned in close. "But you forgot one thing, Richard. You left me with the bakery." 6 months later, Sarah's hearth was the most popular destination on the Maine coast. Once the FBI cleared the basement, removing the press and the fake money, Sarah had legally claimed the reward money for aiding in the takedown of a federal crime syndicate. It was more than enough to buy the building outright from the state, renovate the entire kitchen, and hire a full staff. The basement was completely remodeled. Where the counterfeit press once sat, there were now state-of-the-art, climate-controlled wine cellars and proofing ovens. Sarah stood at the front counter on a sunny Saturday morning, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. The line of customers stretched out the door. Detective Pendleton was sitting at his usual table, enjoying a massive cinnamon roll. She looked around at the warm, bustling space she had built with her own 2 hands. She had started with absolutely nothing but betrayal and a bag of flour. Now she had an empire of her own making, built not on lies and hidden secrets, but on fire, sweat, and truth.